What if I told you that one stormy night would change everything a young woman believed about justice, family legacy, and the dark secrets hidden within England's most prestigious circles? This is exactly what happened to Charlotte Pemberton Hayes on a night that would shake the very foundations of her world. The ancient stones of Thornfield Manor groaned under the assault of the worst storm the Cotswolds had seen in decades. Lightning split the October sky like jagged silver scars, illuminating the Gothic towers and weathered gargoyles that had watched over the Pemberton family for 3 centuries. Inside the manor's oak-paneled halls, 19-year-old Charlotte Pemberton Hayes sat alone by the dying embers of the great fireplace. Her veterinary textbooks from Cambridge scattered across the Persian rug like fallen leaves. The electricity had failed hours ago, leaving only the flickering dance of candlelight to push back the darkness that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice of the old manor. Charlotte pulled her wool sweater tighter around her shoulders, trying to focus on her studies despite the financial stress that had forced her to take a leave from university. The weight of her family's declining fortunes pressed down on her like the storm clouds above. Lady Margaret, her 75-year-old grandmother, had retired early, leaving Charlotte to wrestle with both her textbooks and her troubled thoughts. The manor felt impossibly vast and empty, each shadow seeming to harbor the ghosts of better times when the Pemberton Hayes name commanded respect throughout England's countryside. Then it happened. A sound that made Charlotte's blood run cold pierced through the howling wind. The desperate, agonized cry of a horse in distress. It wasn't the familiar whinny of their own gentle mares, safely tucked away in the modern stables, but something far more primal, more desperate. This was the sound of an animal fighting for its very life. Charlotte's veterinary instincts kicked in immediately. She grabbed a heavy flashlight and her grandfather's old rain slicker, then plunged into the storm without a second thought. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet as she fought her way across the cobblestone courtyard, rain lashing her face like icy needles. The sound came again, closer now, from the direction of the old stone stables that hadn't been used in years. The ancient wooden doors hung askew on their iron hinges, creaking ominously in the wind. Charlotte's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing empty stalls thick with dust and cobwebs. But there, in the farthest corner where the shadows were deepest, something moved. What she saw next would be burned into her memory forever. A magnificent white thoroughbred lay collapsed in the moldy straw, its once pristine coat now matted with mud, blood, and something far worse, the unmistakable marks of deliberate cruelty. Needle marks dotted the horse's neck in precise rows, and strange surgical scars crisscrossed its flanks like a roadmap of torture. But it was the eyes that truly broke Charlotte's heart. Those deep, intelligent brown eyes held a pain that went far beyond physical suffering. This was a creature that had been betrayed by the very humans it had trusted, and the psychological damage was written in every trembling muscle of its powerful frame. "Oh my God," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "What have they done to you?" As she approached slowly, speaking in the gentle tones her grandmother had taught her, the horse lifted its noble head with tremendous effort. Despite its obvious agony, there was something regal about the animal, something that spoke of bloodlines stretching back to the finest racing stables in England. That's when Charlotte noticed the small brass nameplate still attached to a torn leather halter. Windsor, property of Dr. R. Ashworth, Royal Veterinary College. The name hit her like a physical blow. Dr. Reginald Ashworth had once been her family's closest friend, a brilliant veterinarian who had shared countless dinner parties at this very manor. He had been like an uncle to Charlotte, teaching her about horse anatomy and inspiring her to pursue veterinary medicine. But that was before the scandal, before the whispered rumors about unethical practices that had eventually led to his disgrace and the loss of his license. Windsor, she remembered now. This was the legendary thoroughbred that had vanished from Ashworth's estate 3 months ago, the horse that racing circles had whispered about in hushed tones. Some said it was worth more than most people's houses, a descendant of Secretariat with bloodlines that could be traced back to the Arabian horses of medieval kings. But looking at the broken animal before her, Charlotte realized that Windsor's true value had nothing to do with money or prestige. This was a living being that had suffered unimaginable torment, and every instinct in her body screamed that she had to help. Thunder crashed overhead as Charlotte knelt beside the injured horse, her hands already moving to assess the damage. Windsor's breathing was labored, his pulse erratic, and the needle mark suggested he had been subjected to some kind of experimental drug regimen. But beneath all the trauma, she could sense the incredible spirit that had somehow carried him through the storm to find sanctuary at Thornfield Manor. "You're safe now," she whispered, though she had no idea if that was true. "I promise you, whatever they did to you, it ends here." As if understanding her words, Windsor's eyes closed, and for the first time since Charlotte had found him, his breathing seemed to steady. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the old stable something had shifted. A bond had been forged between a young woman fighting to save her family's legacy and a magnificent horse fighting to reclaim his dignity. Neither of them knew that this moment would spark a battle that would expose corruption in the highest circles of British society, challenge the very foundations of animal rights law, and ultimately prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to look away when others suffer. The real storm, Charlotte would soon discover, was just beginning. The morning after the storm brought an eerie calm to Thornfield Manor, but Charlotte's mind was anything but peaceful. As golden sunlight filtered through the diamond-paned windows of the manor's ancient library, she found herself surrounded by leather-bound volumes that had witnessed 3 centuries of family history. Lady Margaret sat in her favorite wingback chair, her silver hair catching the light as she carefully examined a collection of old documents that Charlotte had never seen before. "Grandmother, there's something about Dr. Ashworth that doesn't make sense," Charlotte said, pacing between the towering bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. "Windsor didn't just wander onto our property by accident. Those injuries, those needle marks, someone did that to him deliberately." Lady Margaret's weathered hands paused over a particular leather journal, her blue eyes growing distant with memory. "Charlotte, my dear, there are things about Reginald Ashworth that your family chose to forget. But perhaps it's time you knew the truth." She opened the journal with trembling fingers, revealing pages covered in meticulous handwriting that made Charlotte's blood run cold. The journal belonged to Dr. Ashworth himself, somehow left behind during one of his last visits to Thornfield Manor years ago. As Charlotte read the entries aloud, her voice grew increasingly horrified. The pages detailed a systematic program of illegal experimentation on thoroughbred horses, using cocktails of performance-enhancing drugs that were banned not just in racing, but in veterinary practice altogether. "March 15th, 2023, Charlotte read, her voice barely above a whisper. Subject W7 Windsor showed remarkable tolerance to the new steroid compound, increased muscle mass by 12% in just 2 weeks. Minor side effects include elevated heart rate and occasional seizures, but these are acceptable for the potential gains. Lord Blackwood is particularly interested in the results for his stable." Lady Margaret closed her eyes, pain etched across her aristocratic features. I suspected something was wrong when Reginald started asking strange questions about our bloodlines, about the old breeding records. He was obsessed with creating what he called the perfect racing machine. Horses that could run faster, longer, and harder than nature ever intended. The journal revealed a network of corrupt, wealthy clients who paid astronomical sums for Ashworth's services. Names that Charlotte recognized from society pages and racing circles filled the pages. Lords, business magnates, and even members of parliament who were willing to torture animals for the thrill of winning prestigious races and the massive gambling profits that came with them. April 2nd, 2023, Charlotte continued reading, her hands shaking with rage. Windsor continues to resist the psychological conditioning protocols. Unlike the other subjects, he maintains his spirit despite the physical modifications. This defiance is both fascinating and problematic. May need to increase isolation periods and reduce food rations to break his will. The most disturbing entries described Ashworth's attempts to break Windsor's spirit through psychological torture. The magnificent horse had been kept in complete darkness for days at a time, denied social contact with other horses, and subjected to loud noises and flashing lights designed to create a state of constant anxiety and fear. But Windsor had never broken. Even as his body was pumped full of experimental chemicals and his mind was assaulted with deliberate cruelty, the horse had maintained a core of dignity and resistance that drove Ashworth to increasingly desperate measures. June 18, 2023. Charlotte read through gritted teeth. Subject W7 attacked Dr. Harrison during today's injection session. The animal's aggression is becoming unmanageable. Recommend immediate termination and organ harvesting for research purposes. The heart and lung tissue could provide valuable data for future subjects. Lady Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Dear God, he was going to kill Windsor just to study his organs. Reginald has become a monster, Charlotte. The man we once knew and trusted has sold his soul for money and prestige. The final entries in the journal painted a picture of a man spiraling into complete moral bankruptcy. Ashworth had begun planning to expand his operation, targeting horses from smaller stables whose owners wouldn't have the resources to fight back legally. He had even identified several horses from rescue organizations, animals that had already suffered abuse and would be easy to acquire without raising suspicions. That's how Windsor escaped, Charlotte realized, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The storm must have damaged something at Ashworth's facility. Windsor saw his chance and ran, probably knowing it was his only hope of survival. Lady Margaret stood slowly, her cane tapping against the Persian rug as she moved to the window overlooking the stables, where Windsor was now recovering. But Reginald still has legal ownership papers, Charlotte. In the eyes of the law, Windsor is stolen property, and we're harboring a thief's goods. He could have us arrested and take Windsor back to continue those horrible experiments. The weight of their situation settled over Charlotte like a suffocating blanket. They had saved Windsor's life, but they were powerless to protect him from the legal system that would force him back into the hands of his tormentor. Ashworth's wealth and connections in the veterinary establishment would make him nearly untouchable, while the Pemberton family's declining fortunes left them vulnerable to expensive legal battles they couldn't afford to fight. There has to be something we can do, Charlotte said, her jaw set with determination. We can't let him take Windsor back. Not after what we've read. Not after what that poor animal has endured. Lady Margaret turned from the window, and Charlotte saw a spark of the fierce determination that had made the Pemberton family legendary throughout the Cotswolds. Then we fight, my dear. We fight with everything we have, and we pray that justice still means something in this country. As if sensing their conversation, Windsor's gentle whinny drifted through the open window from the stables below. The sound was stronger now, more confident than the desperate cries Charlotte had heard during the storm. Windsor was healing, both physically and emotionally. But time was running out. Charlotte closed the journal with a snap, her mind already racing with plans. "Grandmother, we need help. We need someone who understands both animal rights law and how to fight powerful people who think they're above the law." "I may know just the person," Lady Margaret said, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Emma Whitmore. She's a barrister who specializes in animal rights cases. Brilliant Oxford graduate, and she's never lost a case involving animal cruelty. More importantly, she's not afraid of anyone, no matter how much money or influence they have." Outside, the peaceful English countryside stretched toward the horizon, but Charlotte knew that beneath its serene surface, a battle was brewing that would test everything she believed about justice, family honor, and the courage required to stand up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The real fight for Windsor's freedom was about to begin. The morning sun cast long, golden rays through the ancient windows of Thornfield Manor's stables, illuminating what would become the most crucial healing process Charlotte had ever undertaken. Armed with her Cambridge veterinary knowledge and Lady Margaret's centuries-old family wisdom, she approached Windsor's recovery with a determination that surprised even herself. The magnificent thoroughbred lay in the freshly prepared stall, his white coat still bearing the terrible evidence of Dr. Ashworth's experiments, but his eyes now held a flicker of hope that hadn't been there during the storm. "The old ways are often the best ways, my dear," Lady Margaret said softly, her weathered hands carefully arranging bundles of herbs she had gathered from the manor's ancient medicinal garden. "Your great-great-grandmother used these same remedies to heal the cavalry horses during the Great War. Lavender for calming the nerves, comfrey for healing wounds, and chamomile for reducing inflammation. Nature's pharmacy has been here all along, waiting for us to remember its power." Charlotte knelt beside Windsor, her trained eye cataloging each injury with clinical precision, while her heart ached for the suffering this noble animal had endured. The needle marks on his neck were infected, the surgical scars along his flanks were poorly healed, and his overall condition suggested months of systematic abuse. But beneath the physical trauma, she could sense something even more concerning: the psychological damage that came from betrayal by those who should have protected him. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice carrying the same gentle authority that had been passed down through generations of Pemberton women. "We're going to take this slow, one step at a time. No one's going to hurt you here." The first step was cleaning the infected wounds with a solution Lady Margaret had prepared from elderflower and honey, a recipe that had been written in the family's medical journals dating back to the 1800s. As Charlotte carefully dabbed the mixture onto Windsor's injuries, she was amazed to see how the horse's tense muscles began to relax. The natural antiseptic properties of the honey combined with the healing compounds in elderflower created a treatment that was both effective and gentle. "You see how he responds to the old remedies?" Lady Margaret observed, her blue eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "Modern medicine has its place, but sometimes we forget that our ancestors knew things that took centuries to develop. This honey comes from our own beehives, and the elderflowers were picked at dawn when their healing properties are strongest." Over the following hours, Charlotte implemented a comprehensive treatment plan that blended cutting-edge veterinary science with traditional English countryside healing methods. She administered carefully calculated doses of antibiotics to fight infection, while simultaneously applying poultices made from herbs that had grown in Thornfield's gardens for 300 years. The combination was remarkably effective. Windsor's fever broke within the first day, and his appetite began to return. But the most challenging aspect of Windsor's recovery wasn't physical. It was earning back his trust in humans. The psychological trauma from months of abuse had left him skittish and defensive, flinching away from any sudden movements and showing signs of severe anxiety whenever strangers approached. Charlotte knew that healing his spirit would require patience, consistency, and a level of empathy that went far beyond her veterinary training. "Trust is like a delicate flower," Lady Margaret explained as they watched Windsor from outside his stall. "Once it's been crushed, it takes time and gentle care to grow again. But horses have long memories for both kindness and cruelty. If we show him consistent love and respect, he'll remember what it feels like to be safe." Charlotte developed a routine that became sacred to both her and Windsor. Every morning at sunrise, she would enter his stall slowly, speaking in soft, reassuring tones about everything and nothing: the weather, the other horses, her studies at Cambridge, her dreams for the future. She would brush his coat with long, gentle strokes, working out the knots and tangles while massaging his muscles with a mixture of arnica and sweet almond oil that Lady Margaret had taught her to prepare. The breakthrough came on the third day, when Windsor voluntarily stepped forward to nuzzle Charlotte's shoulder as she prepared his morning feed. The gesture was small, but it represented a monumental shift in their relationship. For the first time since his rescue, Windsor was choosing to trust, choosing to believe that not all humans would hurt him. "Look at that," Lady Margaret breathed, tears glistening in her eyes. "He's remembering what love feels like." Charlotte's feeding regimen was as carefully planned as her medical treatments. Instead of the processed feeds that most modern stables used, she prepared meals from organic oats grown on the manor's own fields, supplemented with fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden and herbs specifically chosen for their nutritional and medicinal properties. Nettle for iron, dandelion for liver support, and rose hips for vitamin C. Each ingredient served a purpose in rebuilding Windsor's strength from the inside out. The transformation was remarkable. Within a week, Windsor's coat began to regain its lustrous shine. His eyes brightened with intelligence and curiosity, and his movements became more fluid and confident. The infected wounds healed cleanly, leaving only faint scars as reminders of his ordeal. More importantly, his personality began to emerge, playful, intelligent, and surprisingly gentle despite everything he had endured. "He's not just healing," Charlotte observed one evening as she watched Windsor interact with the manor's other horses through the paddock fence. "He's becoming himself again, the horse he was meant to be before Ashworth destroyed his trust in the world." Lady Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "The Pemberton family has been healing horses for generations, Charlotte. It's in your blood, this gift for understanding what they need. Your great-grandfather could calm the wildest stallion with just his voice, and your grandmother, my dear departed husband's mother, once saved an entire stable from a plague using nothing but herbs and determination." As the days passed, Charlotte found herself spending more and more time with Windsor, not just as his veterinarian, but as his friend. She would read to him from her textbooks, explaining the science behind his treatments while he listened with apparent interest, his ears pricked forward attentively. She shared her fears about the family's financial troubles, her dreams of becoming a royal veterinarian, and her growing certainty that Windsor's arrival at Thornfield was no accident. "You came here for a reason," she told him one evening as golden sunset light streamed through the stable windows. "Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was just luck. But I believe you're going to help us save this place, and we're going to help you find your way back to being the magnificent horse you were always meant to be." Windsor's response was to gently rest his great head against her shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that filled Charlotte's heart with hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever legal battles they might face with Dr. Ashworth, she knew that the bond between them had been forged in love and sealed with the ancient magic of healing that had been passed down through generations of her family. The real miracle wasn't just Windsor's physical recovery. It was the restoration of his faith in the goodness that still existed in the world. 3 weeks into Windsor's recovery at Thornfield Manor, something extraordinary was about to happen that would change everything Charlotte thought she knew about destiny, bloodlines, and the mysterious ways that life finds a path forward even in the darkest circumstances. The autumn moon hung full and luminous over the Cotswolds countryside, casting silver shadows across the ancient stone walls of the manor and bathing the rolling hills in an ethereal glow that seemed to whisper of magic and miracles waiting to unfold. Charlotte had been sleeping fitfully in her four-poster bed when Windsor's urgent whinnying pierced the peaceful night air. But this wasn't the desperate cry of pain she had heard during the storm. This was something entirely different, something primal and urgent that spoke to instincts older than civilization itself. She threw on her wool robe and rushed barefoot across the cold flagstones, her heart pounding with a mixture of concern and inexplicable anticipation. The scene that greeted her in the stables took her breath away. Windsor stood protectively over something in the fresh straw, his magnificent white coat gleaming like polished marble in the moonlight streaming through the stable windows. As Charlotte's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she gasped in wonder and disbelief. There, nestled against Windsor's powerful legs, was a tiny foal, impossibly small, impossibly perfect, and impossibly alive. "Oh my God," Charlotte whispered, her veterinary training warring with pure amazement. "Windsor, you were pregnant this whole time. How did I miss it? How did anyone miss it?" The foal was unlike anything Charlotte had ever seen in her textbooks or during her clinical rotations at Cambridge. Its coat was a lustrous cream color that seemed to glow with its own inner light. But it was the distinctive marking that made Charlotte's knees weak with recognition. Along the foal's left shoulder ran a streak of pure gold. Not yellow, not blonde, but genuine metallic gold that caught the moonlight and reflected it back like spun treasure. Lady Margaret appeared in the stable doorway, her silver hair flowing loose around her shoulders, and her eyes wide with an emotion that bordered on reverence. "Dear Lord in heaven," she breathed, her voice trembling with awe. "Charlotte, do you know what you're looking at? Do you understand what this means?" The elderly woman moved slowly into the stall, her movements careful and respectful, as if she were entering a cathedral. Windsor allowed her approach, somehow understanding that this human posed no threat to his precious offspring. Lady Margaret knelt in the straw, her weathered hands hovering over the foal without quite touching, as if the little creature were made of the finest crystal. "The golden shoulder mark," Lady Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I haven't seen one in 60 years, not since my own grandmother showed me the last horse born with this blessing. Charlotte, this foal carries the bloodline of the royal studs from the 1700s, the same horses that carried kings into battle and queens to their coronations." Charlotte felt the world tilt around her as the implications sank in. The golden marking wasn't just unusual, it was legendary. According to family records that went back centuries, horses born with this distinctive coloring appeared perhaps once in a generation, and only in bloodlines that had been blessed by royalty itself. These weren't just thoroughbreds. They were living pieces of British history, carriers of genetic heritage that connected them directly to the great war horses and ceremonial mounts of the crown. "But how is this possible?" Charlotte asked, her scientific mind struggling to process what her eyes were telling her. Windsor was in Ashworth's facility for months. If he was pregnant, surely someone would have noticed. Surely there would have been records, veterinary care, something. Lady Margaret's expression darkened with understanding. Reginald knew, Charlotte. He had to have known. This explains everything. Why he was so desperate to get Windsor back. Why he was willing to risk everything to continue his experiments. He wasn't just trying to create a faster racehorse. He was trying to unlock the genetic secrets of the royal bloodlines themselves. The foal, Charlotte found herself thinking of the little creature as Sterling, a name that seemed to fit perfectly with his golden markings, struggled to his feet with the determined awkwardness of all newborns. His legs were impossibly long and delicate like a dancer's, but there was already a strength in his movements that spoke of the power he would one day possess. When he looked at Charlotte with his large, intelligent eyes, she felt a connection that went beyond anything she had learned in veterinary school. Word of Sterling's birth spread through Little Wickham with the speed that only small English villages can achieve. By dawn, a steady stream of locals had begun arriving at Thornfield Manor, drawn by rumors of the miraculous foal with the golden shoulder. Mrs. Henderson from the post office, Tom Blackwood the blacksmith, Sarah Chen who ran the village tea shop. They came bearing gifts of fresh hay, homemade oatcakes, and the kind of quiet reverence that the British reserve for truly extraordinary moments. "Haven't seen anything like this since my grandfather's time," said old Tom Blackwood, his calloused hands gentle as he offered Sterling a handful of sweet clover. He used to tell stories about the golden horses, said they were touched by something divine. Thought they were just fairy tales, but here we are, looking at living proof. Charlotte watched in amazement as Sterling seemed to understand that he was special, that he was the center of something important and wonderful. The foal moved with a grace that belied his few hours of life, his golden marking catching the morning sunlight and sending ripples of reflected light across the stable walls. When children from the village school arrived with their teacher, Sterling actually seemed to pose for their sketches and photographs, standing perfectly still with his head held high in a display of natural nobility that took Charlotte's breath away. "He knows he's royal," Lady Margaret observed with a smile. "Look at the way he carries himself, the way he interacts with people. It's not just breeding, it's bloodline memory, generations of horses who knew they were destined for greatness." The local veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Morehouse, arrived in the afternoon to examine both Windsor and Sterling. Her professional assessment confirmed what Charlotte's heart already knew. Both horses were in perfect health, and Sterling's genetic markers suggested he carried not just the royal bloodlines, but also the enhanced intelligence and physical capabilities that had made those bloodlines legendary. "This foal is going to be extraordinary," Dr. Morehouse told Charlotte as they watched Sterling nurse contentedly. "His bone structure, his muscle development, even his neurological responses. Everything suggests he's inherited the very best traits from centuries of selective breeding. But more than that, there's something almost mystical about him. I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 30 years, and I've never seen a newborn with this kind of presence." As evening approached and the last of the village visitors departed, Charlotte found herself alone with Windsor and Sterling in the peaceful stable. The mother and foal had bonded perfectly, Windsor's protective instincts balanced by a gentle patience that allowed Sterling to explore his new world with confidence. Watching them together, Charlotte felt a profound sense of rightness, as if this moment had been destined from the beginning. "You planned this, didn't you?" she said softly to Windsor. "Somehow, you knew that Thornfield was the right place for Sterling to be born. You knew that here, he would be safe and loved and celebrated for what he truly is." Windsor's response was to nuzzle Charlotte's shoulder gently, his dark eyes holding depths of intelligence and gratitude that made her heart swell with emotion. Sterling, meanwhile, had discovered the joy of running in small circles around his mother, his golden marking flashing like a beacon of hope in the gathering twilight. As Charlotte settled down in the straw to keep watch over the miraculous pair, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sterling's birth was more than just a beautiful accident. It was a sign, a promise that sometimes the most wonderful things emerge from the darkest circumstances, and that love and protection can create miracles that science alone could never explain. The golden foal of Thornfield Manor had arrived, and with him came the promise that some legacies are too precious to be destroyed by greed or cruelty. The grandfather clock in Thornfield Manor's great hall had just chimed midnight when Charlotte heard the unmistakable sound of vehicles approaching through the darkness, their engines deliberately muffled but still audible to someone who had grown up listening to every sound the ancient estate made during the quiet hours. Her heart immediately began racing as she recognized the tactical precision of the approach. This wasn't the bumbling arrival of local police or the ceremonial procession of Ashworth's legal team from earlier that day. This was something far more sinister, something that spoke of careful planning and ruthless determination to achieve a goal regardless of the consequences. Charlotte had been sleeping fitfully in the chair beside Windsor's stall, her phone charging on a nearby hay bale and her grandmother's old shotgun within arm's reach. Not that she had any intention of using it, but Lady Margaret had insisted that the ancient weapon remain accessible as a deterrent. Sterling lay curled against his mother's warm flank, his golden marking barely visible in the dim stable lighting, while Windsor stood alert and protective, his ears pricked forward as he too sensed the approaching danger. The sound of car doors closing with deliberate quiet sent a chill down Charlotte's spine, and she immediately knew that Ashworth had decided not to wait for the legal process to run its course. The man who had once been her family's trusted friend had clearly chosen to take what he considered his property through force rather than risk the possibility that public opinion or legal technicalities might work against him. Charlotte's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, her mind racing through the limited options available to a 19-year-old girl facing what was essentially a home invasion by someone with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. That's when inspiration struck with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of absolute desperation. Charlotte opened TikTok on her phone, quickly typed "Emergency Live, Horse Theft in Progress at Thornfield Manor, Cotswolds" as her stream title, and hit the Go Live button without a second thought. Within seconds, her phone screen showed that viewers were already joining. First dozens, then hundreds, drawn by the urgent nature of her title and the late-night timing that suggested something genuinely dramatic was unfolding. "Everyone who's watching this, please listen carefully," Charlotte whispered into her phone's camera, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "I'm Charlotte Pemberton Hayes at Thornfield Manor in the Cotswolds, and Dr. Reginald Ashworth is about to break into our stables to steal Windsor and Sterling, the horses I've been caring for. This man has been conducting illegal experiments on animals, and he's coming to take them back to continue torturing them. Please, if you're watching this, call the police and tell them what's happening." The viewer count was climbing rapidly. 500, 800, 200 people now watching live, as Charlotte carefully positioned her phone to capture the stable area while keeping the screen dim enough not to immediately alert the intruders to her presence. Comments began flooding in from viewers across the UK and beyond, people who had been scrolling through late-night social media and stumbled upon what was clearly a real emergency unfolding in real time. "OMG, is this real?" typed a hoarse girl, Manchester. "Someone call 999 now," demanded a Cotswolds local. "I'm calling police right now. Stay safe," promised Animal Rights UK. The comments section became a rapid-fire stream of concerned viewers, sharing the stream with friends, calling emergency services, and offering support and advice to Charlotte as she faced the most terrifying moment of her young life. The stable door creaked open with the ominous sound of old hinges protesting against forced entry, and Charlotte's blood turned to ice as she saw the silhouette of Dr. Ashworth framed in the doorway. He was no longer the distinguished gentleman in the expensive suit from earlier that day. Now he looked like exactly what he was, a desperate man willing to commit serious crimes to protect his twisted research and his reputation. Behind him, Charlotte could make out at least two other figures, probably hired muscle brought along to handle any resistance they might encounter. "I know you're in here, Charlotte." Ashworth's voice carried the cold authority of someone accustomed to intimidating those who stood in his way. "This doesn't have to be difficult. Just step aside and let us take what legally belongs to me. Windsor and Sterling are coming with me tonight, and there's nothing you or your grandmother can do to stop it." Charlotte kept her phone camera trained on the unfolding scene while whispering updates to her rapidly growing audience. "He's here. He's actually here. There are at least 3 of them, and they're moving toward Windsor's stall. The viewer count is over 2,000 now. Please, everyone, keep calling the police and sharing this stream. We need help." Windsor sensed the approaching threat and moved protectively in front of Sterling, his powerful body tense and ready for confrontation. The magnificent thoroughbred had endured months of abuse at Ashworth's hands, and Charlotte could see in his eyes that he had no intention of allowing his foal to suffer the same fate. Sterling, still young but already showing the intelligence and spirit of his bloodline, pressed close to his mother while watching the intruders with alert, fearful eyes. "There they are," Ashworth said with satisfaction, pulling what appeared to be a tranquilizer gun from his coat. "The breeding pair that's going to revolutionize equine performance enhancement. Sterling's genetic markers alone are worth millions to the right buyers, and Windsor's proven resistance to psychological conditioning makes him invaluable for developing new control techniques." The livestream viewer count had exploded to over 5,000 people, with comments pouring in so fast that Charlotte could barely read them. But what she could see filled her with hope. Dozens of viewers were confirming that they had called emergency services. Local news stations were being alerted, and the hashtag #SaveWindsor and Sterling was already beginning to trend across British social media. "You're making a huge mistake, Reginald," Charlotte said, stepping into view of both Ashworth and her phone camera, her voice stronger now as she drew courage from the thousands of people watching and supporting her. "Everyone can see what you're doing. Thousands of people are watching this live right now, and they're all calling the police. You can't just steal these animals and pretend it's legal." Ashworth's expression darkened as he noticed Charlotte's phone for the first time, the implications of a live broadcast hitting him like a physical blow. "Turn that off immediately," he snarled, raising the tranquilizer gun in her direction. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. These animals represent years of research and millions of pounds in potential profits. I won't let some sentimental girl destroy everything I've worked for." But it was too late for Ashworth to contain the situation. The live stream had taken on a life of its own, with viewers screen recording the footage, sharing clips across multiple platforms, and creating a permanent record of his attempted theft and threats. Charlotte could see in the comments that major UK news outlets were already picking up the story, and the hashtag was spreading beyond animal rights activists to include celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens outraged by what they were witnessing. "Huh. The whole world is watching you now, Dr. Ashworth," Charlotte said, her voice filled with the quiet strength that comes from knowing you're fighting for something bigger than yourself. "Everyone can see exactly what kind of person you really are." In the distance, the sound of sirens began to wail across the Cotswolds countryside, growing louder with each passing second as multiple emergency vehicles raced toward Thornfield Manor. The cavalry was coming, summoned by thousands of concerned citizens who had witnessed a crime in progress and refused to stand by and do nothing. The battle for Windsor and Stirling's freedom had become a public spectacle, and there was no going back. The wailing sirens that had been distant echoes across the Cotswolds countryside suddenly erupted into a cacophony of flashing blue lights and roaring engines as 3 armed response unit vehicles screeched to a halt outside Thornfield Manor's ancient gates. Charlotte's live-stream viewer count had exploded to over 50,000 people, with comments flooding in so fast they became an indecipherable blur of outrage, support, and desperate pleas for someone to save the horses. The hashtag Luja Save Windsor and Stirling was trending across the entire United Kingdom, and major news outlets were already scrambling to get reporters to the scene of what was rapidly becoming the most dramatic animal rescue story in British social media history. "Armed police! Drop your weapons and step away from the animals!" The commanding voice of Inspector Sarah Mitchell cut through the night air like a blade, her tactical team spreading out in perfect formation around the stable complex. Dr. Ashworth's face went white with shock as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a simple property dispute anymore. It was a full-scale public relations disaster that would destroy everything he had worked to build over the past decade. Charlotte kept her phone steady, continuing to live-stream every moment as the armed officers moved with professional precision into the stable area. "Everyone watching, this is incredible," she whispered into her camera, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "The police are here. They're actually here. There are armed officers surrounding Dr. Ashworth right now, and he still has that tranquilizer gun pointed at Windsor." The standoff that followed was unlike anything the quiet village of Little Wickham had ever witnessed. Ashworth, realizing that his carefully planned theft had turned into a nightmare scenario, made the desperate decision that would seal his fate forever. Instead of surrendering peacefully, he raised the tranquilizer gun toward Windsor's neck, his finger tightening on the trigger as he snarled, "If I can't have them, then no one can. These animals represent years of research, and I won't let some sentimental girl destroy everything I've built." But Windsor, the magnificent thoroughbred who had endured months of torture and abuse, was not about to become a victim again. As Ashworth's finger moved toward the trigger, the powerful horse reared up on his hind legs with a fury that spoke of every injection, every cruel experiment, every moment of pain he had suffered in silence. His front hooves struck out with deadly precision, missing Ashworth by mere inches, but sending the tranquilizer gun flying across the stable floor, where it shattered against the ancient stone walls. That's when Stirling, the golden foal who had been born into this world of conflict and danger, made a decision that would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms worldwide. Despite being only weeks old, the young horse possessed an intelligence and courage that seemed to transcend his age. As Ashworth lunged toward the fallen tranquilizer gun, Stirling bolted from behind his mother and placed himself directly between the desperate veterinarian and Windsor, his small body trembling but his stance defiant. "No!" Charlotte screamed, dropping her phone as she threw herself forward to shield Sterling with her own body. The live stream continued from where the phone had fallen, capturing a sideways view of the unfolding drama as Charlotte wrapped her arms around the golden foal while Windsor positioned himself protectively over both of them. The image of a 19-year-old girl and a newborn foal standing together against a man with decades of power and influence became an instant symbol of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Inspector Mitchell had seen enough. "Taser! Taser! Taser!" she shouted, and the sharp crack of electrical discharge filled the stable as Dr. Ashworth collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing as 50,000 volts coursed through his system. The man who had once been respected throughout Britain's veterinary establishment now lay twitching in the moldy straw of an abandoned stable, his expensive suit soiled and his reputation destroyed forever. "Suspect is down! Secure the scene!" Mitchell commanded, her officers moving swiftly to handcuff Ashworth, while paramedics rushed in to ensure he hadn't been seriously injured by the taser deployment. Charlotte's live stream continued to capture every moment, the viewer count now approaching 100,000 as people across the UK and beyond watched the dramatic conclusion of a story that had gripped the nation's attention. But the real drama was just beginning. As the police searched Ashworth's vehicles, they discovered a mobile veterinary laboratory that would have made Dr. Frankenstein proud. Crates of illegal performance-enhancing drugs, surgical instruments designed for experimental procedures, and most damning of all, detailed plans for expanding his operation to include horses from rescue organizations across England. The evidence was overwhelming, and it painted a picture of a man who had completely lost touch with any sense of medical ethics or basic human decency. "Ladies and gentlemen watching this live stream," Charlotte said, picking up her phone with shaking hands as the immediate danger passed. "What you've just witnessed is the arrest of a man who was systematically torturing animals for profit. Dr. Ashworth had plans to expand his operation, to hurt more horses like Windsor, to destroy more lives in the name of creating super racehorses for wealthy clients who didn't care about the suffering they were causing." The comments section exploded with reactions from viewers who had watched the entire confrontation unfold in real time. "Hero!" typed I's British horse girl. "Charlotte, you saved them both," declared Animal Rights UK. "This is the most incredible thing I've ever seen on social media," posted a London reporter, who turned out to be an actual journalist from the BBC who had been following the story. Inspector Mitchell approached Charlotte with a mixture of professional authority and genuine admiration. "Miss Pemberton Hayes, what you did tonight was incredibly brave, but also incredibly dangerous. You could have been seriously hurt." She paused, looking at Windsor and Sterling, who were now calm and safe in their stall. "But I have to say, your live stream probably saved these animals' lives. Without the public pressure and the evidence you captured, Ashworth might have gotten away with this." As dawn broke over the Cotswolds, painting the ancient stones of Thornfield Manor in shades of gold and rose, Charlotte realized that her life had changed forever. The live stream had ended with over 200,000 viewers. The story was being picked up by news outlets across the globe, and her phone was buzzing with interview requests from everyone from the BBC to CNN. But more importantly, Windsor and Sterling were safe. Dr. Ashworth was in custody, and the evidence gathered from his mobile laboratory would ensure that he would never hurt another animal again. Lady Margaret appeared in the stable doorway, her silver hair catching the morning light as she surveyed the scene with the satisfaction of someone who had lived long enough to see justice prevail. "Well done, my dear," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of Pemberton family pride. Your great-great-grandmother would be proud. She always said that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with swords or guns, but with courage and the willingness to stand up for those who cannot speak for themselves. The battle for Windsor and Stirling's freedom was over, but Charlotte knew that the real work was just beginning. The story that had started with a storm and a desperate horse seeking sanctuary had become something much larger, a movement that would change how Britain thought about animal rights, social media activism, and the power of ordinary people to stand up against corruption and cruelty. As she watched Windsor nuzzle Stirling in the peaceful morning light, Charlotte smiled through her tears, knowing that some victories are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The morning after Dr. Ashworth's dramatic arrest at Thornfield Manor, Charlotte woke to discover that her world had fundamentally changed overnight in ways she could never have imagined. Her phone, which had been buzzing incessantly since the live stream ended, now showed over 300 missed calls, 2,000 text messages, and notification alerts from social media platforms she didn't even remember having accounts on. The hashtag #SaveWindsor and Stirling had exploded across the United Kingdom's digital landscape like wildfire, becoming the #1 trending topic on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook simultaneously. By 7 in the morning, the ancient cobblestone drive leading to Thornfield Manor looked like the staging area for a major news event, with satellite trucks from BBC News, ITV, Sky News, Channel 4, and even international outlets like CNN and Al Jazeera forming an orderly queue that stretched nearly half a mile down the country lane. Reporters in expensive suits stood practicing their opening lines while camera crews tested equipment and sound technicians adjusted microphones, all preparing to tell the story that had captured the nation's imagination in a way that no one could have predicted. "Charlotte, my dear, I think you need to see this," Lady Margaret called from the morning room, her voice carrying a mixture of amazement and concern that made Charlotte's stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. The elderly woman was seated in her favorite chintz armchair, surrounded by every major British newspaper spread across the antique mahogany table like a paper mosaic of headlines and photographs. The front page of the Times featured a dramatic photograph of Charlotte holding Stirling, while Windsor stood protectively behind them, with the headline, "Teenage Hero Saves Royal Horses from Torture." The Guardian's front page showed a still frame from the live stream, capturing the moment Stirling had bravely positioned himself between Dr. Ashworth and his mother, with the caption, "Courage comes in all sizes. The foal who stood against cruelty." Even The Sun, known for its sensational approach to news, had chosen dignity over drama with their headline, "Britain's Bravest Girl, 19, live streams rescue of tortured thoroughbreds." But it was the editorial in the Telegraph that brought tears to Charlotte's eyes. Written by renowned equestrian journalist Victoria Ashford Smith, the piece eloquently captured what the story meant to the British people. In an age when cynicism often overshadows compassion, when profit frequently trumps principle, Charlotte Pemberton Hayes has reminded us of the values that make Britain truly great. Her courage in the face of overwhelming odds, her refusal to abandon those who could not speak for themselves, and her innovative use of modern technology to expose ancient cruelties represents the very best of British character. The television coverage was even more extraordinary. BBC Breakfast had dedicated their entire morning program to the story, featuring interviews with animal rights experts, legal analysts, and even a representative from Buckingham Palace, who confirmed that Her Majesty was following the situation with great interest and admiration for the young woman's courage. ITV's Good Morning Britain had assembled a panel of veterinarians, social media experts, and members of Parliament to discuss the broader implications of Charlotte's actions for animal welfare legislation. Most remarkably, the story had transcended traditional political divisions in a way that few issues ever managed to achieve in modern Britain. Conservative MP Sir Reginald Worthington Smythe, known for his traditional views on property rights, appeared on Sky News declaring that no amount of legal paperwork can justify the systematic torture of innocent animals. And Miss Pemberton Hayes has shown us that sometimes civil disobedience in service of a higher moral purpose is not just acceptable, but necessary. Labour MP Sarah Chen Williams went even further, announcing her intention to introduce emergency legislation that would strengthen protections for animals used in research and create harsher penalties for those who abuse their positions of trust. The international response was equally overwhelming. CNN's Anderson Cooper had devoted a segment of his primetime show to what he called a David and Goliath story for the digital age, while French television network TF1 had sent a crew to Little Wickham to explore how a small English village had become the center of a global conversation about animal rights. Social media influencers from across Europe and North America were sharing Charlotte's story with their millions of followers, creating a viral phenomenon that crossed language barriers and cultural boundaries. Perhaps most touching of all were the thousands of personal messages flooding into Thornfield Manor from ordinary people whose lives had been touched by Charlotte's courage. A 10-year-old girl from Manchester had sent a hand-drawn picture of Windsor and Stirling with a note saying, "Thank you for saving the horses. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you." A retired veterinarian from Scotland had written a 5-page letter detailing his own experiences with unethical colleagues and expressing his gratitude that someone had finally stood up to the corruption he had witnessed throughout his career. The financial support was equally extraordinary. A crowdfunding campaign that someone had started without Charlotte's knowledge had already raised over $200,000 for Thornfield Manor's restoration and the creation of a proper animal sanctuary. Major corporations were reaching out through their public relations firms, offering sponsorship deals and partnership opportunities that could secure the manor's future for generations to come. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals had announced a substantial grant to help establish what they were calling the Windsor and Stirling Centre for Ethical Animal Care. But perhaps the most significant development came in a phone call that Lady Margaret received just before noon. The caller identified himself as Sir David Attenborough's personal assistant, explaining that the legendary naturalist and broadcaster had been deeply moved by Charlotte's story and wished to visit Thornfield Manor to meet Windsor and Stirling personally. "Sir David believes," the assistant explained, "that your granddaughter represents the future of conservation and animal welfare, and he would be honored to lend his support to her cause." The media attention also brought unexpected revelations about Dr. Ashworth's network of wealthy clients. Investigative journalists, energized by the public interest in the story, had begun digging into the veterinarian's financial records and client lists. Within hours, they had uncovered connections to several prominent racing stables, luxury breeding operations, and even some members of the aristocracy, who had apparently been willing to pay enormous sums for Ashworth's enhancement services. The scandal was expanding beyond one corrupt veterinarian to encompass an entire shadow industry of unethical animal experimentation. As Charlotte stood at the window of Thornfield Manor's Great Hall, watching the media circus that had transformed her quiet countryside home into the center of national attention, she felt a profound sense of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This was no longer just about saving 2 horses. It had become a movement that could reshape how Britain thought about animal welfare, social media activism, and the power of ordinary citizens to challenge institutional corruption. "Are you ready for this, my dear?" Lady Margaret asked, placing a gentle hand on her granddaughter's shoulder as they prepared to face the waiting reporters. Charlotte looked out at Windsor and Sterling grazing peacefully in the paddock, their golden coats gleaming in the autumn sunlight, seemingly oblivious to the revolution they had sparked. "I think so, grandmother. I think we're about to change everything." The story that had begun with a desperate horse seeking shelter from a storm had become a national awakening, and Charlotte knew that there was no going back to the quiet life she had known before. 6 months after the dramatic events at Thornfield Manor had captured the nation's attention, the story of Charlotte Pemberton Hayes and her courageous stand against Dr. Ashworth had evolved from a viral social media moment into something far more profound. A case study that was being examined by leading academics, psychologists, and legal experts across the United Kingdom as a defining example of how power corruption, social media activism, and traditional British values could intersect in the modern digital age. Dr. Helena Blackwood, professor of criminal psychology at Oxford University, had been following the case from its inception, and her comprehensive analysis would eventually become required reading for students studying the intersection of power dynamics and ethical behavior. The Ashworth case represents a textbook example of what we call power corruption syndrome, she explained during a packed lecture hall at Oxford's renowned examination schools building. When individuals are granted authority over vulnerable populations, whether human or animal, without proper oversight mechanisms, we often see a gradual erosion of empathy and moral reasoning that can lead to increasingly extreme behaviors. The psychological profile that emerged from Dr. Blackwood's research painted a disturbing picture of how a once respected veterinarian had descended into systematic cruelty. Ashworth's transformation from a trusted family friend to a man willing to torture animals for profit illustrated what researchers call the slippery slope of moral disengagement, a process where individuals gradually rationalize increasingly unethical behavior by convincing themselves that their actions serve a greater good or that their victims are somehow less deserving of moral consideration. What makes the Ashworth case particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective, Dr. Blackwood continued, is how it demonstrates the addictive nature of power and control. Our analysis of his personal journals and communications reveals a man who had become psychologically dependent on the sense of dominance he felt over his animal subjects. The experiments weren't just about creating better racehorses. They were about feeding his need to exert absolute control over living beings who couldn't resist or report his actions. The research revealed that Ashworth's behavior exhibited classic symptoms of what psychologists term power abuse disorder, a condition characterized by an addiction to the neurochemical rewards that come from exercising control over others, too. Brain imaging studies of individuals with similar psychological profiles show alterations in dopaminergic pathways similar to those seen in drug addiction, suggesting that the rush of power can literally rewire the brain's reward systems in ways that make ethical behavior increasingly difficult to maintain. Professor James Whitfield from Cambridge University's Department of Criminology had been equally fascinated by the case, but from a different angle: the role that social media had played in exposing corruption and mobilizing public opinion. Charlotte's live stream represents a watershed moment in what we might call digital vigilantism. He explained during a joint symposium with Oxford that was broadcast live to universities across Europe. For the first time in British legal history, we saw real-time documentation of a crime in progress, with thousands of citizens simultaneously witnessing and responding to injustice as it unfolded. The social media analysis revealed fascinating patterns about how information spreads in the digital age and how public opinion can be mobilized around issues of social justice. Within the first hour of Charlotte's livestream, the hashtag #SaveWindsorandStirling had been shared over 50,000 times, with engagement rates that far exceeded typical viral content. More importantly, the content was being shared not just by animal rights activists, but by ordinary British citizens who saw the story as representing fundamental questions about fairness, courage, and the protection of the vulnerable three. What we observed was a perfect storm of factors that allowed a single individual's act of courage to resonate with millions of people, Professor Whitfield noted. Charlotte's story tapped into deep-seated British values about fair play, the protection of animals, and standing up to bullies, while the live stream format created an unprecedented sense of immediacy and participation that made viewers feel like they were part of the rescue effort. The legal implications of the case were equally significant and had attracted the attention of barristers and solicitors throughout the Inner Temple and Lincoln's Inn. Emma Whitmore, the animal rights barrister who had ultimately represented Charlotte's interests, had been invited to present her analysis to the Law Society of England and Wales. The Thornfield case has fundamentally changed how we think about the intersection of social media evidence and animal welfare law, she explained to an audience of senior legal professionals. Charlotte's livestream didn't just document a crime, it created a new form of legal evidence that courts are still learning how to evaluate and incorporate into their proceedings. The case had established several important legal precedents, including the admissibility of live-stream footage as evidence in criminal proceedings and the rights of individuals to document suspected animal cruelty, even on private property. More broadly, it had sparked a national conversation about the need for stronger protections for whistleblowers who expose animal abuse, particularly in cases where the perpetrators hold positions of professional authority. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the inspector who had led the armed response unit that night, had been invited to speak at police training academies across the country about the role of social media in modern law enforcement. The Thornfield incident taught us that the public can be our most valuable ally in fighting crime, but only if we're prepared to respond quickly and decisively when they provide us with credible evidence, she explained to a room full of trainee officers. Charlotte's livestream gave us real-time intelligence that allowed us to intervene before the situation escalated into something even more serious. The psychological impact on Charlotte herself had been carefully studied by trauma specialists who were interested in understanding how ordinary individuals cope with sudden fame and the responsibility that comes with becoming a symbol of social justice. Dr. Patricia Morehouse, who had continued to serve as the veterinarian for Windsor and Stirling, had observed Charlotte's development over the months following the incident. What's remarkable about Charlotte is how she's managed to maintain her sense of purpose and humility despite becoming a national figure, Dr. Morehouse noted. She's channeled the attention and resources that came from her actions into building something lasting and meaningful. The sanctuary has become a model for ethical animal care that's being studied and replicated across Europe. The case had also provided valuable insights into the role that traditional British values play in modern social movements. The fact that Charlotte's story had resonated so strongly with the British public suggested that concepts like fair play, protection of the vulnerable, and standing up to authority figures who abuse their power remained central to the national character, even in an increasingly digital and globalized world. Professor Margaret Thornton from the London School of Economics had written extensively about how the case reflected broader trends in British society. The Thornfield incident represents a fascinating intersection of old and new Britain, she observed. You have a young woman from an aristocratic family using cutting-edge technology to uphold values that have been central to British identity for centuries. It's a perfect example of how traditional principles can find new expression through modern tools. The educational impact of the case had been equally significant. Universities across the United Kingdom had incorporated the Thornfield incident into their curricula, using it as a case study in courses ranging from veterinary ethics to social media law to criminal psychology. The story had become a teaching tool that helped students understand complex concepts about power, corruption, justice, and the role of technology in modern society. As the academic analysis continued to unfold, one thing became increasingly clear. The events at Thornfield Manor had touched something deep in the British psyche, representing not just a victory for animal rights, but a reaffirmation of the values that many people felt were being eroded by the pressures of modern life. Charlotte's courage had reminded the nation that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by governments or institutions, but by ordinary individuals who refuse to look away when they witness injustice. The case studies and academic papers that emerged from the Thornfield incident would continue to influence thinking about ethics, technology, and social justice for years to come, ensuring that the lessons learned from one stormy night in the Cotswolds would have a lasting impact on British society and beyond. 2 years had passed since that fateful stormy night when Windsor first stumbled into the sanctuary of Thornfield Manor, and as Charlotte Pemberton Hayes stood in the golden afternoon light of the Cotswolds countryside, she could hardly believe how completely her world had transformed from those dark days of financial uncertainty and academic struggle into something that exceeded her wildest dreams of making a difference in the world. The ancient stones of Thornfield Manor now gleamed with fresh restoration, their Gothic arches and weathered gargoyles lovingly restored to their former glory through the generous donations that had poured in from across the United Kingdom and beyond. What had once been a crumbling family estate struggling to survive in the modern world had been reborn as the Thornfield Sanctuary for Ethical Animal Care, a state-of-the-art facility that combined cutting-edge veterinary science with the traditional British values of compassion, dignity, and respect for all living creatures. Charlotte adjusted her pristine white coat, the one bearing the distinctive insignia of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons that marked her as one of the youngest royal veterinarians in British history. Her graduation from Cambridge had been a triumph that made headlines across the country, not just because of her academic excellence. She had graduated summa cum laude with the highest honors in her class, but because of the extraordinary journey that had brought her to that moment of professional achievement. The ceremony at Cambridge had been attended by dignitaries from across the veterinary establishment, including representatives from Buckingham Palace who had come to witness the graduation of the young woman who had captured the nation's heart through her courage and determination. Her thesis, Traditional Healing Methods in Modern Veterinary Practice, a case study of equine trauma recovery, had been published in the prestigious Journal of Veterinary Medicine and was already being cited by researchers across Europe and North America. But it was the sight of Windsor and Sterling grazing peacefully in the restored paddocks of Thornfield that filled Charlotte with the deepest sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. Windsor, now fully recovered from his traumatic experiences, had become the magnificent thoroughbred he was always meant to be, his white coat gleaming with health, his movements fluid and powerful, his eyes bright with intelligence and trust. The scars from his ordeal had faded to barely visible lines, but more importantly, the psychological wounds had healed through years of patient care and consistent love. Sterling had grown into a breathtaking young stallion whose golden shoulder marking had become even more pronounced with age, creating an almost ethereal glow that seemed to capture and reflect the sunlight in ways that left visitors speechless with wonder. At 2 years old, he already showed the intelligence, grace, and nobility that marked him as truly special, not just because of his royal bloodlines, but because of the circumstances of his birth and the love that had surrounded him from his first moments of life. The Thornfield Sanctuary had become far more than just a rescue facility for abused animals. It had evolved into a comprehensive center for veterinary education, research, and advocacy that was setting new standards for ethical animal care throughout the United Kingdom. Students from veterinary schools across Europe came to study Charlotte's innovative integration of traditional healing methods with modern medical techniques, while researchers used the facility's extensive databases to advance understanding of animal psychology and trauma recovery. The educational programs at Thornfield had become legendary in their own right. School children from across the Cotswolds and beyond made regular pilgrimages to meet Windsor and Stirling, learning not just about horse care and veterinary science, but about the broader values of compassion, courage, and standing up for those who cannot speak for themselves. The sanctuary's youth programs had inspired a new generation of animal welfare advocates who carried Charlotte's message of ethical treatment and respect for all living creatures into their own communities. The legal ramifications of the case had continued to reverberate through the British justice system long after Dr. Ashworth's conviction and imprisonment. The landmark trial had resulted in an 8-year prison sentence for the disgraced veterinarian, along with a lifetime ban from practicing veterinary medicine and substantial financial penalties that had been used to fund animal welfare programs across the country. More importantly, the case had led to comprehensive reforms in animal research regulations and the establishment of new oversight bodies to prevent similar abuses from occurring in the future. Parliament had passed the Windsor Act, named in honor of the brave thoroughbred whose suffering had exposed the dark underbelly of unethical animal experimentation. The legislation created the strongest animal protection laws in European history, with severe criminal penalties for those who abuse animals in their care, and comprehensive whistleblower protections for those who report suspected cruelty. The act had become a model for similar legislation in other countries, extending Charlotte's impact far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. The international recognition of Charlotte's work had been equally extraordinary. She had been invited to speak at veterinary conferences in Paris, Rome, and New York, sharing her experiences and advocating for ethical treatment of animals in research and breeding programs. The United Nations had appointed her as a special advisor on animal welfare, a position that allowed her to influence policy on a global scale, while continuing her hands-on work at Thornfield. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II had personally visited Thornfield Sanctuary, spending an afternoon with Windsor and Stirling while discussing animal welfare issues with Charlotte and Lady Margaret. The Queen, herself a renowned horse lover, had been deeply moved by the story of courage and redemption that the sanctuary represented, and had agreed to serve as the facility's royal patron. The financial transformation of the Pemberton family's fortunes had been equally remarkable. The crowdfunding campaigns, corporate sponsorships, and government grants that had flowed from Charlotte's viral fame had not only saved Thornfield Manor from bankruptcy, but had established endowments that would ensure the sanctuary's operations for generations to come. The family's ancient seat was now secure, its future guaranteed by the very values that had guided the Pemberton lineage for centuries. Lady Margaret, now 77 but still sharp and engaged, had become something of a celebrity in her own right, frequently appearing on television programs and at speaking engagements to discuss the importance of preserving traditional British values in an increasingly modern world. Her wisdom and dignity had provided the perfect counterpoint to Charlotte's youthful energy and innovation, creating a partnership that bridged generations and demonstrated the timeless nature of compassion and courage. As the sun began to set over the rolling hills of the Cotswolds, painting the ancient landscape in shades of gold and amber that had inspired poets and artists for centuries, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of fulfillment and purpose. The frightened 19-year-old who had rushed into a storm to help a suffering animal had grown into a confident professional whose work was making a difference in the lives of countless creatures across the world. Sometimes, Charlotte said, speaking to a group of veterinary students who had gathered for the sanctuary's weekly educational program, to protect the finest traditions of our country, we must have the courage to confront the darkest forces that threaten them. Windsor taught me that true honor isn't found in legal documents or certificates of ownership, but in doing what's right even when no one is watching, even when the cost seems too high to bear. She paused, watching as Windsor and Sterling approached the fence where the students stood in respectful silence, their eyes wide with wonder at being in the presence of the horses whose story had become legend. These magnificent animals represent the very best of what we can achieve when we choose love over profit, compassion over convenience, and courage over comfort. They remind us that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in the quiet moments when we decide whether to walk away from suffering or to step forward and make a difference. The legacy of that stormy night at Thornfield Manor would continue to inspire future generations of veterinarians, animal welfare advocates, and ordinary citizens who understood that extraordinary change often begins with a single act of courage. Windsor and Sterling had become more than just rescued animals. They had become symbols of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit to triumph over cruelty and indifference. As Charlotte watched the two horses graze peacefully in the gathering twilight, she knew that their story would continue to unfold, touching lives and changing hearts for years to come. A testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through force or wealth, but through the simple decision to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. Together, we can make a difference in the world, one act of kindness at a time.